Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here with all of you today. Today starts season number 2 of Stories That Inspire Us. Of course, I have an amazing guest on today, and she is on the author series, obviously has written a book. Wow, all I will just say that some of the things that we will be chatting about will be sensitive in nature to some women. So I want to make sure that I put that out there, but without further ado, it is my honor and privilege to welcome to the Stories podcast, Dr. Cassandra LeClair. And I'm holding up her book. I know that our listeners can't see it, but it's Being Whole, Healing from Trauma and Reclaiming My Voice. Welcome, Dr. Cassandra.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Janice. I'm really excited to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. Cassandra, Dr. Cassandra, because I respect the doctor.
Oh, no, please. Cassandra is fine. We don't need.
Okay. Well, thank you. When we initially had our first conversation, it was such a heartfelt conversation, and you really put like your vulnerability on a platform by writing your book. And you'll see a lot that I have a lot of stickers. I do that often a lot when I'm reading somebody's books. I had to take some of them out because I couldn't get to the pages. That's how many there were. This is your story, in your words, your vulnerability, where you were coming from a very sensitive place in your life. Obviously, I have read the book, which, by the way, I of course will make sure that the link for the book is in the show notes, as well as in the Facebook Live in the comments. Would you like to share with us what initially made you sit down one day and say, I have to write this book?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your kind words. For everyone who's listening, Janice already made me tear up before we even started recording, because we were speaking about my book. And this is something, you said, what made me want to sit down and write this? And I have to tell you, I didn't want to. This story, this book, this is stuff I never thought I would share. It is, there are pieces of my healing journey and things that I discuss in there, and really, coping mechanisms or patterns or things that I had or held on to shame for so long that I never wanted to talk about, because I was so worried about what that would say about me or how people would perceive me. So what really happened for me, how I came to write this book, is I am a college professor and had been for years, teaching about a lot of the concepts that I talk about in my book. And I'd always done really well in that space. But yet there were times in my personal life where I just felt like I was so good at helping other people, but I couldn't get there for myself. And I had, done varieties of therapies and all these different things. And I kept saying, I feel like I'm only halfway healed and I want to be whole. And had done a bunch of different, quests on trying to figure out how to heal myself in different periods of time. And then what happened was my family was hit by a drunk driver. And all of a sudden in that moment, in the aftermath of that accident, even though we were minorly physically injured, what it did is it kind of shook me back to this place of feeling afraid. And my reaction to that accident was that my body kind of had all these memories and things flooding back to it, things that I had tried to suppress or contain or just pretend didn't matter for my whole life. And I couldn't do it anymore. And so it was one of those things where I was like, it was my breaking point, even though it wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And that's what I really want to get across to people, is that you never know when somebody else is going to reach that point. You might look at somebody else's life and think, well, that's not that big of a deal, but you don't know what's all stacked up before that. And how this might be the one thing that's impacting them in a different way or triggers something from their past. So saying all this, because after that, I went in and I really started to journal about my experiences. I am an academic nerd at heart. And so I went to the academic library and I did all the reading that I could on different things, because for me, what it was is I had never gone back to talk about or heal from or even acknowledge the fact that I had been sexually abused as a child. Instead, I was determined to prove that it didn't matter and that I was going to just be awesome and look at all these things that I could do. And nobody would ever need to know about that because I was going to be, so good at everything else. And, in this journaling and in this writing for myself, what I uncovered is just several things where, I recognized that that's one of the reasons I was always seeking external validation or people pleasing, because I wanted other people to see me in this way that I didn't see myself in. So I, journaled all this, was working through all this, read my journals, and again, research, academic nerd at heart, read my journals and started seeing those themes, like coding them like we would for research. And so I got out my highlighters and I coded my journals. And those themes that I found became eventually the chapters in my book. But what happened is, as I was reading it, I just was hit with this feeling of, you're not the only person who has these experiences. You are not the only person who feels these things. And so you need to share this. And I get emotional just saying that, because I feel really called that I was supposed to write this book. It wasn't anything that was planned. It certainly wasn't, I bear a lot of secrets in there and I talk a lot about things that I've done that I'm not proud of. And so it really wasn't something I ever intended to do, but it was something that through that process, and now through being able to share this with other people and through really being able to process all of those experiences, the level of healing I feel. And, way back to the beginning of the story, when I said, I thought I could do that for other people, but I couldn't find it for myself, is now I finally feel like I have that peace inside and that acknowledgement and understanding of myself.
And that is so important, the acknowledgement and the understanding. And you, as you said, you're a professional in psychology, and you coach and you teach and you mentor, whatever we want to call it. But it was your story. It was almost like the story behind the story. There's what happened to you, which is horrific as a child. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But there are also the triggers that you mentioned, which a lot of us don't know that we are going to be triggered until something happens. And if you don't mind, I would like to read a little something out of your book. Is that okay with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because when I read this, and I've read it several times, I've gone back to different parts of the book, and I'm like, oh my God. And this is in Cassandra's book, page 47 to be exact. I got to take off my glasses. I own that piece of my story, and I control my feelings about how it has shaped periods of my life. I did a lot of work to heal those pieces. The journey to finding myself after that diagnosis and through the sickness was the hardest thing I had done up to that point. That blew me away. You continue to live your life, but underlying issues were masking how maybe you thought or where you wanted your life to go. But here you are today. I am profoundly grateful, and I feel very blessed to be in this space with you right now, because there are so many people that need to hear your story that have unfortunately perhaps gone through the same thing.
I think the thing for me, when I talk to people who've read my book, it's really not a book about abuse. It's a book about the aftermath of it, the aftermath of the spaces I was keeping myself in because I didn't know how to process or heal, or the things that I was feeling. And the conversations that I've gotten to have with others then who, said, oh, I don't talk to myself very nicely, or I hadn't thought about that thing that was still impacting me, or I didn't recognize that this trigger is really about this other thing. That's what I think that we are all kind of on this path of doing, is, like you said, exploring and understanding and having our triggers revealed to us, sometimes, unfortunately, in the most inopportune times, right?
Right.
But it's that kind of that willingness to look at them, and that willingness to say, okay, this may be what's happening to me in this moment, but this doesn't mean that this is who I am, or that this is reflective of everything, that I've built to this point, or whatever it is, right? And being able to be a little less harsh on ourselves, I think, is a good starting point. And I think if we can take away, some of those layers, then we really can see, paths to go forward that maybe feel a little easier, as opposed to seeing the path ahead of us filled with obstacles and undoing all of these patterns or what have you.
Yes. And one thing that also really sparked my interest, which is when I talked about my story in the past, is the behavior that we enact within ourselves. And what I mean by that is, even though we know a behavior or a pattern probably is not the best choice for us overall, we do it because it's a safety net. It's normal. Therefore, okay, this is normal. It's not great, but out there is even scarier, and I can't deal with out there.
Yes. And that's the thing, I tell my kids this all the time too, is that your brain believes whatever you tell it most, right? It just does. And your brain's job is to conserve your energy and protect you, right? So if you are used to this pattern, like you said, my pattern is, I'm going to chill on the couch and watch Netflix instead of going for a run, then I can tell myself I want to go for that run, and I can try to self-motivate, but my brain's job is to protect me and to keep me safe and to keep me conserving energy. So it's going to naturally default to well, no, we're used to this pattern over here, and Netflix and the couch seems really good. So motivating yourself to change those patterns, it is hard. And that's something we shame ourselves for all the time, that, oh, I couldn't do this, or it was, why can't I stick with something? And so really, again, having that grace for yourself and understanding that, okay, you have to work with your brain a little bit. You have to, kind of trick it. Okay. We know this from neuroscience. So telling yourself, affirmations, or setting those small goals for yourself and really believing them, that's real. It's not just this woo-woo, superstitious stuff that I think some people.
Yeah, you are so correct. And it's like when you have that internal dialogue with yourself. How many times for instance, have we spoken to ourselves? Well, as you were just mentioning about the Netflix and being on the couch, guilty, scrolling in my phone too much, guilty, that was an aversion for me not to maybe deal with something, or maybe do what I had to do at the time. Not that I've done anything recently, let's just be clear about that. But it's true, because that pattern of behavior always directs us around a different avenue. I was just speaking to someone this morning, about, okay, you plan your day and you do certain things because it's a routine. Those routines feel good, but life happens. And I think when life happens in a way that we don't expect, it really throws us off guard. What would you say was the one thing for you? And you had mentioned, of course, your car accident, but also before that, everything that you went through as a child, being sexually abused, eventually manifested itself into physical ailments. And I think the big question for maybe a lot of people, I know for myself, and I obviously am not an expert in this field, those emotional and really heart-wrenching things that we go to, what is it that would be a good way for people to understand maybe why that happens. Not that it happens, we know that it happens, but why does it happen maybe with some people and not others?
That's such a great question. And this is something, an area, so I have lupus and several other diagnoses that are tacked onto it. And the way I've kind of come to understand it through, talking with different practitioners of all different kinds and doing research as well is, and I firmly believe this, no one, it would take a lot of science to to convince me otherwise that, so for me thinking about, okay, I had several terrible childhood experiences, as do many people, right? So then those things, especially if they happen repeatedly, are compounded, right? So you're never just getting over one event because then the next event is happening. So that's where, you might have heard a lot about CPTSD, which is, complex PTSD, because it's that repeated traumas that people go through. So from my understanding from the different experts that I've talked with, is that then, take someone like me, just use my personal experience, is that those repeated traumas then, especially with me never talking about them, never moving through them, never processing all those emotions, all that energy, everything just stored in my body, right? With me then internally, becoming more frantic, or my nervous system becoming more, hypervigilant, or in that fight or flight state, or just kind of, hyper aroused, my nervous system from being in a trauma state for much of my childhood. At what point can your body no longer sustain that? And I think that if you look at in particular the statistics for autoimmune disease, they do impact women more than men. If you look at a lot of like childhood traumas, again, you see a connection then between childhood trauma and autoimmune. So really, thinking about my own experiences and everything, it's that eventually, I think if you don't process those emotions, and we see it across other things too, right? If people aren't managing and handling their stress or dealing with their emotions, eventually it does present into physical ailments. And so I really think that when I got sick with lupus, I think that was my body's way of trying to get me to wake up and understand and, like, hey, we're going to shut you down if you do not deal with some of these things. But I didn't, I like to say I'm pretty stubborn, I guess. And I had to be hit over the head several times before I was like ready to do the healing. And that was a space where I think my body just, it couldn't, by then I was 38 when I started, or no, when I got lupus, when I got diagnosed with lupus, I was in my 30s. So, that's decades worth of holding on to things and not letting go of these big traumas, or, never fully processing and letting go of things. And it's like my body just finally couldn't do it anymore.
Dr. Cassandra, would you say that that's I have to make sure I use the correct word, physiological response to the trauma that we go through?
I mean, I think for many people, what it is your body eventually has to have a physical response because we ignore the emotional responses so much. I mean, look at our society, honestly, if you have a broken arm, you're going to go see a doctor about it, right? Or most people like physical ailments. I have an ache and I have a pain. I'm going to pop a pill, or I'm going to go somewhere. You have a mental health issue, or you have a crisis or a trauma. And so many individuals, don't believe in mental health care still, unfortunately. Or we do have a culture where it's like, suck it up, brush it off. Other people have it worse. That's just how it is. So I think, unfortunately, there is so much shame associated with admitting that you might need help, or that there might be a larger issue, or that you think it is impacting you, especially if your stressor or crisis or trauma or something like that does seem smaller. And I'm trying to say that really, pointedly, because, people will judge other people's traumas or crisis all the time. And it's really not our business of, how big something is to somebody else. But I think that if we think something that happens to us isn't that big of a deal, or we shouldn't make a big deal out of it, or we try to make ourselves smaller, or really not dig into it, our brain tries to forget it, but our body does not. Right?
Right. Yeah, that is so true. And that paragraph that I read, I'm always going back to that, and because after each chapter, you have what's called messages for moving forward. And what you said in this message moving forward was be grateful and thankful for each step. And you really talked about how we move forward and how to move forward. So your journaling, this book started out really by you journaling everything.
Mm-hmm.
You said you were a nerd and highlighted stuff. I can see you doing that. But it just goes to show you that your story was yet, I think in a lot of ways, is still yet to be untold, because there's so many people that need to hear your story. What is a word of advice or a message to anyone who will be listening on how they can start that process of moving forward? Because it's really a complex issue.
I think, so often we have goals and we have this end goal in sight, right? The end goal with healing for most people is like, I want to be happy and everything's going to be magical. Well, if you look at that goal, especially when you are not happy, that feels impossible and that feels overwhelming. It feels like you can never get there and it can feel anxiety producing. So then that's where we don't even want to start, because how can we, again, we feel like we can't ever get there sometimes. So for me, I have to force myself to start every single day, even now. Every single day I have to force myself to start. So what does that mean? I don't always feel like sitting and journaling in my notebook. So guess what? I don't. I made all of this easier on myself. So what I do a lot of times is I have my phone with me all the time, as most people do. So if I have a feeling or a thought or something triggered me, or I had something come through, I would start a note in my phone. And I just started there. So then it took the pressure off, like not, oh, I have to journal, or, oh, what am I going to write about today? Or what's my prompt? Or I don't have anything meaningful to say. It would just be me kind of taking notes about my day or about how I felt, or if something came through. A lot of times for me, this would even happen when I was driving. Okay, so obviously that's not an opportune time to use your phone. Please don't do that. So I would before I would drive, then I would keep the audio notes open on my phone. And maybe there's a better way to do this that somebody else knows, but this is just what I did. And so then I would just talk to myself in my car and have the audio notes. And doing that process of accountability for myself, or checking in. Sometimes I, just had stuff for the day, and sometimes it would be really benign. Other times then I would go back and look through my notes and I'd be like, oh, okay, you felt this like 3 days in a row. So what is that then? Or wait, every day at this time, you're kind of getting upset. Or wait, this person over here, yeah, you're real annoyed with them always. What is that really? Or whatever it is, right? So you start to kind of, for me at least, what that does is when I have too much uncertainty, or I feel like there's these goals out there and I don't know how to get them, I feel out of control and then I feel anxious. So for me, understanding my own patterns and understanding myself helps me figure out ways I can take a little more control. I can take a little more action. Okay, so if I know that every afternoon I kind of have a slump, guess what then? I don't take an hour lunch anymore. I eat something quick, and if it's nice out, I try to get outside and move a little bit, or whatever it is, right? So it's helped me not only for, just relationships with other people, but it's helped me with my own motivation and productivity, just to really, again, understanding my patterns, my needs, my wants, the people I don't say those things to, the people I feel comfortable to say those things to. So, again, I'm sorry, I profess on every answer. It's a job hazard.
No,
but I think that's the thing for people is just, if you're like, I don't want to journal today. Okay, cool. Don't. Then just write a note in your phone that says, I didn't want to journal today. And then, maybe you look at it later. Or, maybe if it's physical fitness, instead of making that big goal, it really is, there's that saying, like, how do you eat an elephant? Like one bite at a time. It's the same concept, right? And this is where, again, I do think it's so important to recognize you aren't alone in this. We really think we are a lot of times, and we convince ourselves that there isn't anyone to support us or to be there, or who's going through what we're going through. So really also, if some days I don't feel like it, I go online and I find somebody who is feeling like it. And then I kind of, use them as motivation. So again, almost like giving yourself permission to do a tiny, tiny bit instead of feeling like you have to do it all at once.
I love how you describe that, because that is what I'm sure a lot of people feel at different times. Like, for instance, in my journal this morning, and guilty, I didn't feel like journaling, but then I'm like, no, I'm going to journal. And I wrote, one of the first things I wrote was, it's time to give yourself a break.
Mm.
Because I was getting so hard on myself. I'm not journaling today. Like, we all have those moments. But I want to go back to where you were chatting about help, because one of the chapters in your book is about how you went about help. It's about help.
Hmm.
What is one thing to you that sticks out in that chapter for you that you always go back to?
I think about that chapter probably more than any other one, because I finally know how to ask for help. And I did it. So every time I ask somebody for help, or I acknowledge that I need help, I think about that process and what that looked like for me. Hyper independence is a source of control for a lot of people. Like, if I hand it over to somebody else, or if I ask for help, then it's out of my control, or then I can't, or sometimes it's a pride thing for people, right? We feel we should be able to do everything on our own, or whatever it is. Sometimes it's vulnerability for people. They don't want to acknowledge that they would need help, or they're ashamed or embarrassed. So there's a lot of feelings attached to asking for help for people for a variety of reasons, right? And a lot of it's modeled to in our childhood and so many things. So for me, when I got sick, I was on disability, I was bedridden, people helped me, but I didn't ask them to. They just did, because, that's what you do when somebody gets sick. I had good friends who just swooped in, and here's some meals, or doing different things, right? So I learned how to accept help then, because I didn't really have a choice, right? My kids needed to eat. But accepting help that's there, that somebody's just doing for you, is still different than being able to admit and ask somebody for help. I never once during those years called up a friend and was like, hey, I really need you to make me dinner tonight. It took me years to be able to do that. And that's how I honestly, one of the steps that I knew I had really healed from was a few years after my diagnosis. I called up my neighbor and I was like, look, can you help me make some meals for the kids? Or can you help me do this? And I remember feeling like I knew she would say yes. I knew she would be happy to do it, and was probably wondering why I had never asked before. But yet somehow the idea of asking made me feel so vulnerable, am I weak? Or I don't even think I consciously had those thoughts, but somewhere along the way, we must, or we wouldn't have that hesitation. Right. So,
Right.
so for me now, it's thinking about what happens in the future to me if I don't ask for this help. Okay. It's like what you said, and then also thinking about, this is why I encourage people to have many different types of people in your life who can offer you different kinds of support, right? Because there are a lot of people who I know who are good at different things, or who are good at different types of support too. So for me, really understanding who to ask for what type of support I needed. And what I realized then is that made those individuals feel good too, because then they felt like that they were doing something in their wheelhouse, or something that made them feel good, right? And so I think really allowing myself permission again to be vulnerable and ask for help, and not shame myself for it. And then also recognizing that it's somebody else's job to tell me no. And so what I mean by that is, so often, whether it be for help or a bunch of other things, we don't ask, because we worry about, oh, I don't want somebody to think this. It's not our job to, control somebody else's response. It's not our job to, it's so, or maybe you're like, well, they might be too busy to say yes. But that's not on you. That's on them. If they're too busy and they still say yes, then that's on them to learn their own boundaries and to stop overextending. And I say that as somebody who is guilty of it, But so again, like recognizing that me being able to ask and receive whatever response someone gave me was something that I really had to get through.
Wow. You talked about asking for help and the acceptance
Mhm.
of help. Do you think that with either one, there is a stigma with that? Like when we ask for help, like, oh, I don't want to ask that person for help. I know they're busy, blah, 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 whatever it may be. I mean, what is the worst possible scenario that somebody says, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now?
Right. Exactly. That's just it. Is what's the worst case scenario? Somebody says no. I mean, if you ask somebody for help and you genuinely need it and they get mad at you and they berate you and they're really mean to you, then I think that that says a lot more about like that relationship or that individual, or maybe you should question what's going on with them at that point. Right. But instead we hold ourselves back in so many ways. We prevent ourselves from, having that vulnerable space, because what that is, asking for help, is admitting that we have needs. And admitting that we have needs, nobody wants to be seen as needy. Well, guess what? We all have needs, right? Having needs doesn't make you needy. It makes you human. That's one of my favorite things to say. So acknowledging that you have needs, and then being able to express to other people, like, I need some help in this moment. Is there, can you do this for me? Or do you have any ideas? Or again, asking somebody for a specific favor or request or something like that. And I think too, what that does not only hopefully helps you in the moment for whatever task or problem you're having, right? But what it can do over time is, the cool thing for me now is I absolutely don't worry about a lot of stuff I used to worry about, because I know that if I got into trouble here, or here, I would ask for help. Whereas previously, I probably would have thought like, well, how am I going to manage this? How am I going to manage that? And now, I'm still managing the majority of everything, but I know I don't have to if I can't.
So it's like a delegation of your thoughts and what you need to get done, what you need help with, versus going into that, I want to say, rabbit hole of the what is. Well, what if this can't person? Then I'm going to have whatever it may be.
Yeah. And I do think too, we absolutely, part of it is, again, we look at people's roles, and it depends on what, where people are, like, not to get all gender stereotypical here, but I've taught gender communication for a number of years too. So you think about stereotypically, men would not ask for help emotionally, more so, right? So thinking about that, what does that look like? Well, for somebody to ask for emotional support, typically one of the reasons men don't do that is because they've never been conditioned to think that that was okay, right? To talk about their feelings or what have you in our society, right? So then we get mad at them as adults that they don't tell anybody what they need. Well, they've been conditioned their whole lives not to, right? So really even understanding too, that some of the reasons that you're not asking somebody for help is like based on some antiquated notion of how we should all be. And hopefully right now we are moving into a different space where we've seen some of the effects of what that looks like. We've heard for generations, like, that you keep things in, or, that we're closed off or what have you. And we know now, not just from our own personal experience, but also from, studies that have been done and what have you, that actually isn't healthy, for you physically or mentally. So really even reminding yourself, like, what choices are you making for yourself? Like, why are you so okay to self-harm, right? So if you are keeping yourself in this space, like, you are actually harming yourself. And we do that to ourselves at the same time that we would get mad at a friend or somebody else who was doing it.
Oh my gosh, I think you just hit the nail on the head, because I can think of, different things on different scenarios, in my life that have transpired. I do want to ask you an off-topic kind of question, because now that we've brought gender into the conversation, it's a funny question. So in your opinion, when let me just back up a little bit. I had this discussion with my husband the other day, and he said, and in my opinion, women do communicate better than men. And he's such a loving person. And he says, hey, you should kiss a husband. So I thought for a minute, and I know what he meant. But I said, oh, okay, you want me to kiss a husband? Sure, I will. So I walked out the door, and he's like, where are you going? So it's in the details, right? And women, we're guilty of this too. I mean, I'm kind of using my husband as an example, but I think women are better communicators. And as you said, men are conditioned, I think, to not show their emotions, to not ask for help, only if they need a beer or something, but I could be wrong.
Well, I think too, one of the things and it's changing a lot, a lot of the research is changing too, as we have become more aware of trying to, not force gender roles on people and stereotypical gender norms and things like that. But, if you look even at the games that kids play and things like that, one of the things that we would talk about in class a lot is that little girls stereotypically are playing games more like house or school, or games that are based on relationships. So there's a lot of talk and play, or maybe they play Barbies and the Barbies are having like a conversation, right? Whereas boys stereotypically are playing more like activities, they're playing basketball or they're playing with trucks, or again, I'm vastly stereotyping here, but those games don't involve a lot of relational conversation, right? So even if you think about the ways that you were conditioned to have relational conversations, be it even in your playtime, and then adding on to that, your family conversations and things like that. And we are much more likely still, even if we see a little boy crying, to be like, suck it up, brush some dirt on it, versus asking them if they're okay, or asking them to tell us how they feel about something. So I think, again, I hope that we're going to keep seeing a shift. I hope that we're going to help keep seeing a different understanding of the need for everybody to have, emotional space and expression, because we know the other effects of it. If you look at suicide rates, for example, and you look at male suicide rates versus females, I mean, we there are mental health crises happening. That's not fake, that's real. So some of the things that we can do, just even as a society, are to be more accepting and acknowledging of those things, and to be more understanding of we need to give space and permission for people to have those clear conversations, or for people to say those things about feelings. And, that's hard because we as adults talk about that, but then you have to trickle it down, right? So the kids in the locker room are having those conversations or whatever else.
Thank you so much for that. In your book, you also talk about and another name of your chapter is Rebuilding Myself. And the first question that you ask is, what I remember most about all the difficult times. That got to me. How would you say rebuilding? I mean, obviously I've read the book, so I have a sense, but how would you say, in your words, being in this moment, how important rebuilding is for anyone who may be going through a difficult time?
It's incredibly important. And it's the thing I think I would say with that is it's a continual process. So it's not a rebuilding and then my house is done. Think of it instead as you got a fixer upper and you're constantly going to be remodeling it. It's that because if you think oh, I'm going to heal this and then I'm done, then when a trigger comes up or something comes through, you're going to shame yourself or be upset or think that you have to start all over. And so it is a process, and it is kind of more like those layers, of you're uncovering different layers and being aware that going through that process, it's messy and it can be difficult. And sometimes you do feel like you're going backwards. So knowing that up front, right? So knowing that up front. So earlier I said your brain believes whatever you tell it most, right?
Right.
So telling your brain, this might be hard, but we can do hard things, or whatever it is for you, right? Or acknowledging, yes, this thing makes me sad, but I can work through the sadness, and really allowing yourself to feel those things and know those things. But again, understanding that it is a process, and every day could possibly look different, right? And not shaming yourself or beating yourself up for it needing to be different for whatever it looks like for you. And I think too, one of the things that can happen, especially if you're yep, I'm ready, I'm going to heal, I'm going to dig in, I'm going to do all this stuff, is that then you can almost make that your life or your job. And so remembering to take space from that too. You are a whole person who has all of these different wonderful interests and ideas and thoughts and things like that, right? So healing doesn't have to be your personality. It's something that is helping you on your journey as you are being who you already are. Like, you're not trying to become somebody else. You're already awesome.
Healing doesn't have to be your personality.
And I mean, I think I'm guilty. I would say that. I think that, I mean, I'm guilty of doing that. I think anybody who first starts stuff, you're like, so again, everything I say, I am in no way saying it's a shameful thing. I'm saying it to, like, hey, look, here's some personal and professional experience. Let's all talk about this, because that's the thing for me. If you can have a space where you feel comfortable talking about your healing with other people, then it becomes a little less scary too, right? It's like, it's that thing under your bed where if you don't look at it, it becomes scarier and scarier. But then once you take a peek at it every once in a while, you turn on the lights, you kind of realize like, oh, that thing isn't as big. That's just a dirty sock under the bed or whatever it is, right? So we have to dig in to do that, right? Otherwise, it just keeps getting scarier and scarier.
That is so true. And Cassandra, when we dig, we need tools.
Yeah.
And I think the right tools are working with someone with, or, talking to a friend, whatever it may be, to kind of take that first step. Because as we chatted about, there's a difference of when you ask and when you accept that help.
Mhm.
This has been such an amazing conversation. Cassandra, how can our viewers and listeners get in contact with you?
I'd love for people, you can find me on social media, on Instagram or on Facebook at Dr. Cassandra LeClair. My website is CassandraLeClair.com. But if you have any ideas or thoughts about content that you're interested in or other things that you'd like to hear about, I love hearing from people. And again, Janice, thank you for this conversation. It means so much to me to be able to really share pieces of my story, and really just want everyone who's listening to know that you're not alone. Even when it feels the most at your core being that you're not, that you are, and that no one could possibly understand, there is somebody out there who really does get what you're experiencing, or understands the feelings surrounding it. So I encourage everyone to just remember that they're not alone.
Thank you so much. And I want to say, as a sidebar, thank you to all of my amazing listeners. And I see some familiar names and some new names. Thank you so much for being here today. Your story matters as well. And of course, Cassandra, I will make sure that all of your contact information is in the show notes. And I also hope, because I am going to ask you right here and now, will you be my guest again on Stories That Inspire Us / the author series?
Oh my goodness. Of course, I would love to. This has been such a fabulous conversation.
Yay, wonderful. And on that note, I just want to say again, we generally touched upon the crux of behind the start of this book. We have so much more to chat about. And Cassandra, I want to thank you again for writing this much needed book. And I hope that it brings you a sense of comfort, knowing that it helped a lot of people, including myself. My name is Janice, the host of Stories That Inspire Us. Remember, if you have a story to share, I am here to help you with that. Please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. And remember, as Cassandra said, there is a difference between asking and accepting. Don't be afraid. You are never alone. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye for now.